Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield. We're very glad right now to welcome back to the program Dr. Gerald Horne, who holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at University of Houston. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. Dr. Horne received his PhD in history from Columbia University and is the author of more than 30 books and 100 scholarly articles and reviews, including the paradigm-shifting book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States. Dr. Horne, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. And I asked you on today because here we are at the 250th anniversary of the U.S. project, and under the Trump administration, the so-called Freedom 250 initiative is in full swing, which, for those of you who are blissfully unaware of what that is, it's a full year of, quote, patriotic programming aimed at teaching kids to love America. But of course, to never question it or critique it or dig even in a shallow way for the truth. So, Dr. Horne, starting off here, I wanted to get your thoughts on some of this programming. And, were you to have a go at programming some vital teachings for the U.S.'s 250th, what might you be highlighting that's missing?
Well, in the first instance, I would highlight indigenous dispossession. That is to say, before the arrival of the interlopers, dare I say invaders, in the late 16th century, in what they called North Carolina, this land was populated from the Atlantic to the Pacific by various indigenous polities. With the arrival of the settlers, their polities were overthrown. And today, I think it is curious, at least, that many of our friends, they're more prone to use the descriptor settler colonialism to apply to historic Palestine than to the United States of America. I'm surprised that the Israelis are not charging anti-Semitism because why don't you use that descriptor for your own homeland? But somehow that's missing. And then I would highlight the fact that many historians agree on, even the most patriotic U.S. historians acknowledge that more Africans fought against George Washington than fought alongside George Washington. And in any case, initially, the George Washington-led forces, they didn't want any Negroes to be in their ranks. But as they found themselves losing battles, they did a 180 to a certain degree. And I think, particularly with regard to the Black population, the fact that our ancestors fought disproportionately against the establishment of the Republic helps to shed light on why Black people today are treated so horribly and atrociously. Because when you fight a war and you wind up on the losing side, you should expect to be treated horribly and atrociously. But instead, even our friends on the left, they tried to tell us, those aforementioned numbers notwithstanding, that somehow the establishment of the United States was a great leap forward for Black people, even though the number of enslaved Africans increased exponentially from 1776, when it was in the hundreds of thousands, to 1861, when it was in the millions. And if that's an abolitionist enterprise, as we are oftentimes told, I'd hate to see an anti-abolitionist enterprise. And in any case, even with regard to the abolition of slavery, if I can digress, I think that the fact that the enslavers were horrified that they were not compensated when they lost their prized property, unlike in the British example, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, where as late as the early 21st century, London was paying off the descendants of slave owners. And we all know about the so-called indemnity that the successful Haitian revolutionaries had to pay to the former enslavers in France. The enslavers in North America, they were driven into poverty in many cases, which helps to explain the rise of Ku Klux Klan. It helps to explain the rather maniacal anti-communism that persists to this very day. since the socialist project has been associated with expropriation of private property without compensation. So, a more accurate rendering of history would do a service, as opposed to this pseudo patriotic claptrap that we're being fed.
Yeah, absolutely. And because you mentioned going back before, before the creation of the U.S., I think that that's also important because we tend to learn about history like, oh, it started 250 years ago, but of course nothing starts in a vacuum. So,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
I actually wanted to bring something up that was never taught to me in school. And I doubt it's taught today, particularly with what's happening to public education these days. But this year is actually also the 500-year anniversary of something else that happened in 1526 when
mm-hmm.
enslaved Africans in what is now Georgia and South Carolina carried out the first recorded slave rebellion in what would become the U.S. And as the Zen Education Project notes, quote, after enduring intense heat, disease, starvation, and of course, the hardships of slavery, enslaved Africans rebelled, burning colonists' home and escaping into the wilderness. And many found refuge among nearby indigenous nations, believed by historians to be the Gwale people, forming one
Mm-hmm.
of the earliest known examples of African and indigenous solidarity and resistance to European colonization, end quote. And obviously, that is a far greater example of freedom than a bunch of slave owning aristocrats signing a document saying that they'd prefer not to have a king.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. I'm impressed, in fact, that you're aware of that because so many historians are not aware of that. Uh, Not to mention uh, those in the lay community, and that's important for a number of reasons. Number one, what happened is that the Spanish, from their Caribbean outposts, had been moving northward to the North American mainland, and because the Africans rebelled, as you just detailed, that's one of the many reasons why we're speaking English and not Spanish. Because if they had not rebelled, then the Spanish would have seized what is now called South Carolina, North Carolina, heading northward. And likewise, with regard to the early settler colonists, I think it's important to begin the story not necessarily in Virginia or Massachusetts, but begin the story, for example, in Florida when the Spanish arrived in St. Augustine in 1565, to begin the story across the continent in what is now New Mexico, where once again in the late 1500s the Spanish had arrived. And this is also revelatory with regard to many other communities. I mean, for example, many in your audience are probably aware of the fact that 1492 not only marks the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but it also marks the year when you had not only a massive expulsion of Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, many of whom migrated into northern Africa, but also a goodly number of the Jewish community. And there's evidence to suggest that on Columbus's ship, there were those from the Sephardic community, and that some ultimately wound up in what is now New Mexico. There was a story in the New York Times a few years ago, you can look it up, about folks in New Mexico today who observe behind closed doors Jewish rituals because, as you recall, uh, being Jewish in His Catholic Majesty Spain could lead to persecution at best, execution at worst. And so you had these so called conversos or new Christians who then migrated across the Atlantic and were seeking to preserve their Jewish rituals. And apparently, we're still doing so in the 21st century, according to this New York Times article. So I think that a more accurate rendition of what has transpired on this territory would not only do a service to history, it would do a service for many communities as well, whose stories oftentimes are not part of the defining narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are my ancestors in southern
Hmm.
Spain and Al Andalus. And well, with regards to that, I'm also curious because we tend to think of the borders today as these there are these hard lines, and they're obviously immovable. But of course, borders change all the time, and also not just if we look back to the so-called independence of the burgeoning U.S., but how then the U.S. treated freedom struggles in its so-called backyard that was made its backyard through the Monroe Doctrine officially, but the idea that the revolution was about freedom and liberation. Well, then why not help those fighting for freedom and liberation against these European monarchies? Why not help those in your own backyard fight for that same kind of freedom and liberation?
Mm. Well, it's interesting to note that there were more than 13 colonies that revolted. For example, I'm about to embark on a project looking at one of those dogs that didn't bark. Speaking of the fact that St. Augustine, because of Britain defeating Spain prior to 1776, was a British colony, British East Florida, as it was called. But they did not revolt. And my hypothesis going in is that because His Catholic Majesty emphasized religion as a marker for society, as noted, you had to be Catholic or be subject to persecution and or execution. Whereas supposedly the Great Leap Forward for the Protestants who defected from the Vatican at the time of Martin Luther, circa 1517, they were outnumbered, and that led to a round robin of religious conflicts. And so, improvisationally and necessarily, uh, they were not able to use as a marker of society and as a marker of settlement of being Protestant. There weren't enough of them. And so they expanded the aperture to race. First, English Protestants incorporating Irish Catholics, incorporating Welsh, incorporating those in the British Isles with whom they had been warring, and then expanding the remit to incorporate more Europeans who had been warring on the shores of Europe, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian, French Catholic versus French Protestant. All of a sudden, when they crossed the Atlantic in a maneuver that would make Madison Avenue blush, they become white, unquote, which in many ways is sort of a war fighting identity. It's the original identity politics, is what I call it. And what happened in St. Augustine is that as a legacy of His Catholic Majesty, you had African soldiers who were armed. And as noted, George Washington was reluctant to put arms in the hands of Africans, and they were not in favor of joining a slaveholders revolt in 1776. And it took until 1820, 1821 for Spain ultimately to join the United States of America, first as a territory and then as a state by 1845. And now, today, Florida is the third largest U.S. state behind California and Texas.
Yeah, I mean, and I also, with regards to the creating race, I also find it interesting, going back to Jews and my heritage, that Jews were slave owners in the South, but in the North they weren't considered to be white enough. And there's that, so that this I again that this idea that the identity is fixed or anything like that, it's always moving. It's always a moving mark.
Indeed. And in fact, I'm embarking on another project, which you, I'm sure, will be interested in given your heritage, which is the case of Leo Frank. You may recall that he was the Jewish man who was lynched in Georgia circa 1915 after being accused of killing, and in fact, sexually molesting a young Christian girl. Now, what's interesting about the Leo Frank case is that he pointed the finger of accusation at the black janitor, Jim Conley. And there was this contestation. You usually don't find this in these soaring narratives about black Jewish relationships. And many in the Leo Frank case were saying, are you going to believe this Negro brute, for example? Over a white man, for example? And the lyncher said, Yeah, and they lynched Leo Frank. And I'm afraid to say that some of the pre-existing scholarship really hasn't dealt with some of these racial tensions, and many people still find it astonishing, as do I, that a so-called white man was lynched based upon the accusations of a Negro man in Georgia in 1915. I think that this will tell us quite a bit about what you were just saying about how these identities are not necessarily fixed and how they tend to evolve and sometimes devolve.
And of course, as they continue to shift, we should be, if we are taught and if we look into that, we are learning more about our present day. Because as James Baldwin said, the past is not, or the past is not, history is not past. Wow. But I think that I want to dig into something a little bit here because this is, of course, also part of the goal of not teaching history. Like Florida's Stop Woke Act that prohibits teaching content that might cause, quote, students guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress. Um, but what's interesting about this, of course, is like earlier this month, for instance, Trump went on like there was a in the Oval Office there were kids younger than teenagers there for some kind of like physical fitness event. And Trump goes off on this tirade about capital punishment and executing protesters and how that's linked to physical fitness, which of course you can see in kind of, like Nazi-esque physical fitness as well, and including Israel. But it's not about saving people from discomfort or anguish at learning about violence. It's a pride in certain kinds of violence. So it's not really that you're trying to avoid teaching a violent past. You're trying to avoid framing certain kinds of violence as bad. So the violence that, genocided the indigenous people, that perpetuated slavery, that's okay. The violence of people fighting back, like the mine wars where people took up arms and shot at coal barons, that's bad, right? So
Mm-hmm.
could you talk a little bit about like the framing of this to avoid making, I get, like, white students predominantly uncomfortable, but at the same time making them uncomfortable with this extreme pride and violence?
And of course, the not so hidden agenda is to indoctrinate these students into a right wing politic. It's emblematic what's happening on campuses today. As you probably know, the right wing is waging a holy war against many universities, particularly against academics, who they see as a kind of resistance movement. And so as a result, they're setting up these schools of civic leadership, for example, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, amongst other campuses, which many students are seeking to boycott because they feel that it's in line with what Mr. Trump is doing with regard to his 1776 commission and his other efforts to imbue the youth with patriotic education, which fundamentally comes down to having the youth sign on to a right wing agenda, and more than that, a Republican right wing agenda. Uh, you've seen the stories, I'm sure, and probably have covered the stories about book bannings in Texas, for example, about the law that you just referenced in Florida, how it's been duplicated in other southern states in particular. And we should not see it as coincidental that disproportionately these kinds of efforts are being replicated in Dixie, for example. Because even though you had slavery in New England, as we know, but it tended to dissipate over time, the Civil War was fought over slavery in the South and the attempt by Southern slave owners to maintain and perpetuate slavery, particularly enslavement of Africans forevermore. And it's difficult to maintain, on the one hand, this posture that the creation of the United States of America was the creation of this shining city on a hill. But at the same time, you have these grimy details about enslavement of Africans, about the African slave trade, about the Middle Passage, about breeding farms where enslaved Africans were bred like bulls for example, um, it's difficult to maintain these two contrasting postures. And so the right wingers said, "Oh, okay, we know what the answer is. You sweep under the rug the grimy details and concentrate on what we think is the uplifting narrative."
Yeah, and obviously that has to include violence. Otherwise, how do you explain a country that's constantly at war, even though it's never being invaded?
Well, that raises another point. I don't think you can begin to understand the war in Iran, the wars in Vietnam, Korea, the coup in Guatemala, the overthrow of the Mossadegh regime in Iran in 1953 without understanding the pre-existing history of the United States of America, up to and including a ultimate penultimate chapter, which is the overthrow of the Hawaii Kingdom in 1893 and the establishment of apartheid state thereafter, and the incorporation of Hawaii as the 50th and presumed final state in 1959. That is to say, there's a direct linkage between what befell the indigenous population, including some of the tactics. That is to say, in the middle of negotiations, as we know, you had the bombing of Iran in mid 2025 and February 2026. That was par for the course for dealing with indigenous leaders. That is to say, they'd be invited for negotiations sessions, and while they were in a negotiating session, their people would be attacked, for example, or there'd be attempts to poison them with the food that they were eating. And so when you break the link between what happened in the United States and how the United States was built and what's happening today with the United States and the world, you're basically puncturing the memory of many of our citizens and forcing them into a kind of amnesia.
Well, and with that, I'd like to, because I see these at protests all the time, people carrying signs that say this isn't who we are. And I'm like, I mean, it is. It might not be who you are personally, but it is who we as a nation are. And I'm wondering, like, can you dive into this a little bit? Because I think that is part of the necessary discomfort of learning this history. And if at the end of it you are not a patriot and you don't believe in the US as a project, why is that so bad? Why is that so scary? Why can't we embrace that?
Well, let me say to begin with that I have supported wholeheartedly the No Kings protests. I think that they're worthwhile, useful, etc. But I think that the name is problematic at best, because what does that mean for Canada, for example, which did not revolt against the crown? And should we now assume and back Mr. Trump for saying that the final stage of the revolution of 1776 should be the annexation of Canada into this grand republic? Should we ignore the fact that Canada has single payer health care, for example, something that we can only dream about south of the border? And should we perhaps do what the Canadians did, or at least what they did in Ontario when they had an analog to the No Kings protest? They called it the No Tyrants protest, the No Tyranny protest, because I think that even though many in this country, they have a critique of socialism. Uh, you can wake them up in the middle of the night and they start babbling about Stalin, for example. But republicanism, this system that in a sense was pioneered in North America post 1776, not by accident, but by design. It did not include the indigenous population. It did not include the black population. To a certain extent, it did not include women of various ancestries, for example. And that's why it's been such an uphill climb to include those who had been omitted. And I think if we had more of a critique of 1776, more of a critique of the history of this country, the path towards reforming, dare I say, radicalizing this republic would be much smoother.
Well, and brings up a question. And obviously, as a professor and an author and a researcher, I mean, this is what you do. But I'm also curious. I mean, how do you get around this indoctrination, particularly as we see it really entrenching itself deeper and deeper, like a really toxic tick? Sometimes I think about like what kind of underground or covert political education was happening in other authoritarian times and places that we don't ever hear about, and what did that mean for any kind of underground resistance that happened in those places and times that eventually led to the topple of those regimes? I mean, as we see the US kind of going back to its roots and becoming more tyrannical, how do you get around this kind of Freedom 250 indoctrination?
Well, I think that steps are being taken to circumvent this indoctrination as we speak. As a matter of fact, I may be overly optimistic. I've been accused of that before, but I do these interviews on the Pacifica station in Los Angeles, KPFK. I've been doing it for years, and we specialize in interviewing scholars. And there is such a great amount of very good scholarship that's being done on virtually every era of this country, every group in this country. I think part of the problem is that we need a grander synthesis, incorporating all of this work into an overarching narrative as opposed to some people looking at 1776 to 1783, others looking at 1893 to 1915, etc. So we need a synthesis. But on the other hand, I'm heartened as I listen to these scholars because it tells me that the indoctrination at least has not worked with regard to the people I'm interviewing, and presumably not working with regard to the students that they're teaching, or as the right wing might say, indoctrinating. And that gives me optimism for the future. And given the fact that I think that Mr. Trump is on the back foot now, although it's not a done deal, that his party will be turned back in the midterms in November 2026, but certainly is on the back foot right now because of this Iranian debacle, particularly compared to where he was a year ago in May, June, April 2025. That also gives me optimism because turning the United States around, it's like turning around a gigantic battleship on the ocean. You just can't turn the wheel and the battleship goes to the left. It takes pulling and tugging and sweating and blood, sweat, and tears. But I'm confident that we're in the midst of that hopeful process.
Well, as a friend of mine said, I don't have the luxury to not be hopeful. So we'll stick with that. And folks, perhaps instead of diving into the Freedom 250, perhaps we can dive into the myriad histories that have brought us to this time and reflect on how we could better turn around this battleship, or just really abandon the battleship. Dr. Horne, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. I really appreciate your insight as always.
Thank you for inviting me.